Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's really a pleasure for me today to be talking with a longtime friend of mine and somebody who I learned so much about journalism from way back in the day when we worked for the Santa Barbara Daily Paper. And it was, those were the good old days. And I'm going to gush just a little bit, but one of the tragedies, in my opinion, of how the news press sort of fell apart was we kind of lost a lot of great journalism. And number one at the top of that list was the man I'm talking to today, Scott Hadley. He's so good, investigative reporter. I learned a lot. Everyone in the newsroom learned a lot. He was definitely a leader of the newsroom. And from that moment, he went and, did some other journalism, but eventually landed in a different role. And, one of the biggest impacts, I think, is we lost a little bit of what Scott Hadley had left in journalism because he's so good. Scott Hadley, thank you for being on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm great. And it's great to see you. Yeah, that was really very nice of you, Josh. And I think that right back at you, I think that, as you know, newspaper journalism is a really cooperative thing, and so you feed off of other people's work and it drives you. And, we're talking about one story, I guess, today, but we worked on a bunch of stories and some high impact stories. And I agree with you. It's a bummer for the community that the paper turned the way it did. It's a combination of ownership, but also just the circumstances of newspapers in general across the country. It's nice to see, though, kind of what's sort of emerging from that, all these community journalism efforts, stuff that you're doing really on your own is pretty amazing. I love watching these, and I still pay a lot of attention to what's going on in Santa Barbara because I love Santa Barbara and I have a lot of connections there and will return there someday.
Yeah, that's great. I look forward to that day, so we can just hang out, have some coffee or whatever. But Scott, yeah. I wanted to talk to you because I thought of you when in the news recently was this decision to be made about David Attias. David Attias, as we know, he was at the time a UCSB student who drove his Saab through a crowd of pedestrians on Sabado Tarde, I guess 21 years ago now. And he killed 4 that night, 5th eventually died. And it was a horrific moment in Santa Barbara and Isla Vista, UCSB community. He was found to be insane, and he served time at Patton. And now he's been living in a home where he's been monitored and medicated. And now he's looking to get out. And so he's going through that process, that hearing. And I wanted to talk to you, Scott, because you and I covered the David Attias event back 21 years ago. We were out there in Isla Vista. We covered it. We talked to people right after it happened. And it was for me, it was like the first big story I had in my career because I was 2 years in as, working as a professional. And I just wanted to talk to you because you really helped me with that story. You mentored me. We did it together, but you really led the effort in terms of your poise and your maturity and your experience and how we approached it. So I wanted to talk to you. What do you remember about that night, Scott? Can you take me back there to that night, the day after? We spent several hours reporting that story that first weekend. What do you recall?
Well, it was a long time ago. And we talked a little bit before we started, trying to kind of jog our memories a little bit because the facts are a little bit fuzzy. But I do remember seeing that line of people on the ground, those bodies. They're pretty late. You were there first. You're working night cops, and I think had just gotten off, and then did we have a beeper? I don't even remember. So essentially, I think it was, this was very nascent tech at the time. And then I got a call, and I don't know, we were trying to figure out who the city editor was. It could have been like Tad Weber, it could have been Andy Rose. It could have been, was it Jesse? It could have been Jesse. I don't even remember. But essentially that this had happened. And I don't know how many facts we had about how devastating it was. Besides seeing the people, which was, you have to process this in a weird and non-emotional way, but it's hard to see that. I mean, that devastation, but weirdly, it was looking at the car to understand like just how devastating that was. The car was mangled, and it was mangled because of it hitting people, and that was kind of hard to come to terms with. But you kind of switch on and say, okay, this is going to kind of suck, but let's put this together, what happened. And I think the challenge with this was it's IV students who are from all over, right? They're not long-term residents there. So it's a little harder to track down people. The other thing is it was IV on a weekend, so a lot of people on that block who then sort of dispersed. This was before social media, so you would probably report it differently now. I think that I don't remember if you had found this person that night or the next morning, but you had talked to somebody who lived in a balcony apartment on Sabado, kind of looking down that block. And I remember being there when you had talked to him already, but being there, and the things that popped out was them hearing not like a car going fast, but accelerating, not braking. And then the impact was really loud. And the aftermath when he got out of the car and started shouting. And this was like a really important bit of information, but sensational. And so we had to be careful with it. And that was that quote, which I do think you got, which was him saying, "I am the angel of death." And why do you have to be careful with that as a reporter, right? Like, oh God, you're going to put that right up there. We wanted to confirm that in some way. This was a person that was, not right next to him. There were a lot of other people there. We want to make sure we got that right. I can't remember. You had a placeholder story from the night before, which I don't remember what it read, but it was like the bare essentials of the facts. At that time, I don't think we were updating the website. I don't think so.
No, we had actually just had a very bare bones minimum website. And I remember, I should remember who called me, but I don't remember, but it was whoever was the night editor. And they said they heard on the scanner that they had black tags. So scanner traffic for, a body, right? And so dead body. And so you have to cover that, right? You can't say I'll do that in the morning. So I went out there and I was told to get something by midnight. So I remember it's just find a law enforcement officer who can give me what happened, the bare minimum, a little bit of the scene, and write it up. And I didn't have an iPhone. This is 2000, 2000, I guess this is. So I didn't have an iPhone and flip phone.
What?
So
was it 2000 or 2001? 2000?
Oh, it was 2001, I guess. Yeah, it was February. Right. So
yeah, I think 2001.
Yeah. So I just called it in. I just read it to the editor and they typed it. And then it about 5 or 6 inches went into the physical newspaper. And then obviously that's when the real reporting starts. That's what I recall about that night.
Yeah, in hindsight, 20 years later, it probably, because it was students, it was IV on the weekend, we probably should have gone out that night and stayed all night. And I'd done that before on other things as a cops reporter, but we didn't. We went the next morning, I should say. We rendezvoused at that location. You found this witness. And then it was basically, all those people, that's the mistake in cops reporting, is like that need to be there right away, not just to be at the scene before, say, it's cordoned off, but because all those witnesses will disperse. And so like trying to recreate what happened is really challenging. I think I benefited from having been a cops reporter for a couple years at the LA Times. And usually what I tried to do was to just break it down to really simple things like the time and like a sequence of events. And I'm a kind of a visual learner. So being able to see, he was driving in this direction. This is where the accident happened. These are where the people ended up. All of that stuff was sort of helpful. And as you build that, you kind of build like a timeline and a visualization of what happened. And I've found that this works with other things, like other kinds of incidences as well. And it also makes it a little, at least for me, it allows me to be a little less emotional about it, because I'm just getting like some bare bones facts about it. And so I think the challenge was you had this great source, and it was just like, we need to confirm this. Clearly there were a lot of people there, so we knew we could find witnesses. And then I think we were lucky because I had the year before, I had some sources, people in IV that I knew, that I talked to, and among them were these two guys, Sevon Matosian and Greg Shields, who had a public access TV show called IVTV. And so for people actually probably were going to school in 2000 or whatever, this was pretty well known. And they did a series of these weekend, essentially videoing the party scene. They'd have themes. It's pretty raunchy, funny, raw kind of stuff, but they both were smart and talented. And despite some of the stuff actually pretty sensitive, I think, to, Sevon worked in a halfway house for disabled kids while he was going to school and doing this stuff. And he really cared a lot about what he was doing in terms of the videoing. Anyway, I called them and they had happened to be, doing what they do. And they came upon the scene within minutes of it happening. And he was shooting video. And so while you went out and were looking for more witnesses, I arranged to meet with them to watch the video. They had not yet contacted the sheriff. I duped the video and told them to dupe the video. They also, this is unbelievable that I did this and you're going to roll your eyes. I said, this is going to be news. We can't, the news press at the time, we couldn't host video, I think, on our website. So what we did was we created freeze frames of what we were seeing, which was, so they got there as he got out of the car. And there was a lot of stuff going on. There was a young man who was doing first aid on people. Oh. And then, there was a lot of people, raw emotion. You just saw this murders. And so there was one group of people trying to just beat the shit out of Attias. And then another couple people that were trying to stop them. Oh. And he had all that. So, and then my suggestion to them was, give me some time, but you should probably talk to CNN. And they ended up doing, I can't remember what national news organization ended up grabbing that video, but they did make contact. It may have been CNN. Yeah. But that was really valuable for us because instantly we had moments after the accident, kind of like what the scene was, the numbers of people, what was being said. We had some confirmation of this quote. We couldn't hear it all, but there were Greg, who was the guy who would interview people, also confirmed that, I believe. And there were, I think we may have found another witness who said some version of that quote that person had given you.
Yeah, you really elevated the storytelling in that story by having those sources and hooking up with Greg and Sevon and finding them, because you and I were able to watch a video, we were able to watch it, and we were able to see these details that we could put in our story. We could describe the scene of seconds after the crash. He got out of the Saab and started fighting with people, started swinging. You see law enforcement come and eventually take him down at the legs with the billy club.
Right. They smacked him with the billy cut and cut him down, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he was really animated and sort of out of control and just almost like shadow boxing at people. And yeah.
And then you could just see the whole scene, and so that was really important. And then you just being so experienced, like getting a copy, because at some point the sheriff's office is going to want that copy. They're going to want it for their investigation.
And they did. I think Sevon actually proactively told them he didn't want to lose his copy, essentially, because they could take it in evidence. So that's why he duped it, but he gave them a copy, I think. I think he took it into them, essentially.
Yeah, so that was good. And we were able to do that. And, part of that other story was, part of that story too is, and we see it even today, it looks, when the final product is done, when people are reading the story online or in a newspaper, it looks so easy. Like, it looks as though these journalists were just able to ask questions and get answers, and then they wrote it up. But we know that's not the case. Back then, we dealt with a lot of defensiveness, a lot of territorial attitude. Why do you want to ask us questions about this horrible tragedy? Can't you wait? Can't you wait a week? Can you come back later? Can you talk a little bit about how some of the students responded to you when you were news gathering, and how you as a journalist show empathy, but at the same time make the case for the journalism?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's probably the worst part of the job that we have. And probably if you ask a cop or firefighter or something like that, having to talk to somebody after something terrible has happened like that, it's just really painful. And from, what it makes you feel like is crap, so you're ripe for being attacked in a sense, because it is this very, just think about it. There was a whole family that was devastated by that, and the Levy family. That was the daughter, the son, and then their childhood friend or something like that. I think the son died a couple of years after, or several years after.
Bert Levy and Ruth Levy.
Yeah.
And
and I think that I may have talked to their mom a couple, not right away, but anyway, it's very difficult. So yeah, you got that. Plus the news press. The news press had, even before the current administration, it always had sort of this reputation of being like not I don't know. They were not enamored by the college community, let's put it that way, right? And so you came in there as this establishment newspaper that didn't do a great job maybe covering that community. IV, it is a community, so we were doing what we could do, but we definitely focused maybe on stories that didn't always cast IV and UCSB in the best light. So I'll say that. So you get a little bit of resistance there, and then you're added on top of it this terrible tragedy, and so you're having to ask this question. So sure, we've got a lot of people who did not want to talk to us, who lashed out at us. And I actually talked to a Nexus reporter. And the reason, like, why would I interview a reporter? The reason I wanted to talk to a Nexus reporter was they were getting calls from national news organization. Some of them actually knew some of the victims, and it was put them in a really peculiar, they were trying to cover the news, they were being interviewed, and they were also suffering a loss. And one of those reporters lashed out at me, like, how could you call me? How could you do this? Why are you, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, of all people, you should know that we have to do this in this job. So I don't know. I don't know if I have that was a very long-winded non-answer. There's not really a good technique. I think part of it is, and you see some reporters handling it in a way that works for them, but probably isn't good for the profession. And that is this unemotional, maybe even cynical, or you just lack that feeling. And the reason you do that is because some people do that is because it is you can't see these things over and over again and suffer that same emotional impact of what you're seeing and not have it take a toll. And so people put up different defenses to be able to do their job, I think. In my case, I was trying to do both things. Like, okay, this is a person, they just saw this crazy thing happen and they're going to be impacted for their whole life. And now I'm going to ask them this really hard question. So I think in those situations, sort of less is more. This is what I'm, this is my name, this is what I do. I'm sorry about having to do this, but I need to talk to you right now. And when I get pushback, I usually say, unfortunately, this is the moment when I can tell this story. I might not be able to do it in the future. And if they still don't want to talk to me, they don't want to talk to me. So it doesn't, I think there are other people that maybe push it a little harder. And anyway, that was my approach. I don't know, what do you do?
Yeah, well, I always just say, I'm really sorry to have to approach you under these conditions. And I really just want to give you an opportunity to talk or share some information about what has happened here. And I feel when I try to allow them to be part of my process, it kind of clicks for them. Like, oh, this is an obligation or an opportunity I have to talk about my community or these people who've been, who are victims or have been impacted. And when they see it that way, it's more of like a shared sort of goal than it is, can you talk to me about what happened? So you sort of have to do that. I've done that, I don't cover much of that anymore, but when you're first starting out, that's kind of all you do. You do the breaking news, you do the crime, and a lot of that stuff happens on the weekends. It was such a sensational story because you had David Attias, the son of this Hollywood, director, producer, The Sopranos. He had a name in the industry. There's not a press release that comes out that says, here's this person's background. We had to pull bits and pieces from people who knew him and interacted with him and roommates. And what we were able to do in that story was sort of talk about what people had observed about him, during his time at UCSB and what led up to that. And that's really the challenge of that story, is having the persistence to be able to keep coming at it after rejection after rejection. Right? I mean, there's 10 rejections for every one person who has some information. And then, of course, the trial, and after that, it was a huge story. I remember talking to Chancellor Yang that night. He's still there, Chancellor Yang. And I don't know if you got this stuff, but there's a part of our story, and every time I read it again, because I talk about it in one of my classes for my breaking news portion, we talk about how to cover things. And every time I read this part of the story, I sort of think, wow, why did we include this in the story? I don't know how we did it, but do you remember at the time, Gail Marshall is in the story. And toward the end, we talked about how she had recently proposed this ordinance that would require people to get permits for parties over 25 people, or sorry, over 100 people. And that's sort of a line in the story. And we used it to sort of show that there's been effort by government leaders to sort of take a look at the party atmosphere in UCSB. Do you recall who did that, or how we ended up talking to her? I think it was just timely. It sort of feels too, and journalists can appreciate this.
Feels like something an editor would have added.
Exactly. Like when there's too many cooks in the kitchen, the story starts to get unwieldy, you know?
Just blame it on the editor. No, I can see why. So, I mean, in hindsight, there were, you know, because of Halloween, because of, what is that? Something, Flotopia. Deltopia, sorry. All these different things that became, you know, whatever, issues for the county. I think this was obviously different, but I think it, you know, so that's probably why it wasn't really appropriate to be in there, but that's probably what an editor was trying to make broaden that issue. I mean, what it became was a story about mental health and parenting and this weird, I mean, like in hindsight, you look at it and like, should he have been sent off to college knowing what they knew about their son? There could have been a lot of other issues that were going on. I think I understand more about bipolar disorder and how that actually can, you know, it gets worse right in that age when you're becoming an adult. So there's things like that, but you know, we're talking about 24 hours within this accident and us still trying to understand why would anyone do something like this, and we didn't really understand it. And there were people that said he was crazy, and I think did we get this thing about him being called Crazy Dave or something like that? And you know, that first night of just getting his name was a big deal, and then I don't remember if we ever, at least I don't think I ever tracked down which dorm he was in or where he lived. So.
Yeah, law enforcement's not saying his name is this, you know, right afterward. We've got to get it from other people and confirm. And I remember you were able to talk to some of the family members, at least one of them, you know. So, you know, a lot of people who've been in town the last 10 years or so haven't really been privy to your body of work and the great amount of stories that you've done at the news press, at the LA Times. You know, really, and you know, sort of like thinking about you and hearing you talk, I realized why we did so many good stories together, like this one and the Beverly LaCoomber one, and just the little daily ones that you helped me with. Was you really bring out the best of me in my reporting. Like when I would work with you, I would think, damn, I got to do a good job on this because, you know, Scott's really good and he's going to read this. And so I've got to really put my best effort. And that's a quality that you have. And I'm sure many other reporters who you've worked with would feel the same way. And I think that's probably been missing since the day you left and the day that we stopped working together to some degree. But can you talk a little bit about your career and some of the big stories that you did, and you know why you sort of loved journalism and got into it? And I mean, you're one of these brilliant people. You know, you got master's degrees, you can do a lot of different things. You chose journalism, right?
Jeez, can you talk to my kids and just tell them that was way overboard. Super nice of you to say all that.
They'll tell you in 10 years. You know how that goes.
And by the way, that year, the Attias story, that's you know, you did a shitload of work on the Beverly LaCoomber case and elder abuse, big story there. And, you know, 2 years into your career, that's pretty impressive to be able to do that. And I don't see myself in the same way that you just described. I do think that I do miss being a reporter, and as a reporter, I just brought myself, of course, to the table, right? And I have a lot of curiosity. I felt like every job that I had, I'm going to break a story, whether, you like it or not. I'm going to find something. And so I did do that. I'm kind of a late bloomer. I did a lot of different jobs when I was young. I was a grave digger. I was like a bartender. I worked for an environmental organization. I worked in a warehouse. I did some labor work, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I liked writing, but I wasn't very good at it. And I kind of was interested in, and when I worked for an environmental organization, I started writing a lot of what would turn out to be sort of like investigative stories. And these were kind of boring, but they were about like water usage and agriculture and looking at how the system could be rigged in certain ways. And anyway, and then I ended up wanting to get better at that. And I went to journalism school at Berkeley. And then out of there, I did some freelance work. And then I got a job at the LA Times. I worked there for 5 years. But there was something else that was going on during that whole period, which is I wanted to return to Santa Barbara and live there. My wife's family is from Ojai, and she has a brother in Santa Barbara. We lived there for a long time. And so even when I took that job at the LA Times, I was living in Santa Barbara. And I worked at the time, I did not know this, but that was kind of the heyday, the pinnacle times where they have a newsroom of, I don't know, like 2,000 to 3,000 people, editorial editors, writers, photographers, copy editors. I think they're in like 250 now or something like that. But at the time, and they had a lot of different editions. And I just happened to work for the Ventura County edition. That was a really good experience in that at the time there were, so we covered Ventura County, but also a little bit of the Valley. We sometimes did that. And occasionally we would be asked to work downtown to cover shifts or whatever. But the landscape was so different. You were competing with several TV stations, a ton of these local public newspapers, small newspapers, radio, a couple other metros, right? The regional paper in Ventura. And so every day was just like massive pressure to produce. And so there was that, I guess, helped feed that desire to do good work, and that's kind of like how I approached everything. In terms of stories, I like I said, I covered cops, but that first year that I was in Ventura County, there were a couple large natural disasters. There was a flood, there was the Green Meadow fire that burned to Malibu. There was the Oxnard unemployment agency shooting, in which James O'Brien, an Oxnard police officer, was killed right near where we were. And I remembered hopping into a VW Bug with our photographer because he said, I know where he's going. And the guy had left the Oxnard EDD and was driving to Ventura EDD. And he just assumed that's what he was doing. And we pull up right when he was getting out of the car and they started a shootout. So that was kind of a trial by fire of like using your instinct, like knowing the area, trying to think a little bit about things in that context. I did some political reporting, did some stories on a political corruption case, which is sort of straight out of, I don't know, something you'd read like in Jimmy Breslin, where there was a trash company owner who was, mobbed up a little bit, and he was giving money to a guy who was running for supervisor and getting really good deals on a trash contract. So I learned a lot, and I work with people that were just way smarter than me too. So that was super helpful. There was a guy there that I'm still close friends with named Daryl Kelly, who's just a great investigative reporter. And there were a ton of really really good writers. This guy, Fred Alvarez, a good friend of mine, Mary Poles. And these are all Stephanie Simon, who ended up covering the OJ case through the whole thing. And she was like, I don't know, maybe 21, 22 years old and writing column one stories for the LA Times. So that was a really good experience. When I eventually went to the news press, part of going there was because this is where we're going to live. I love this community. I want to be part of it. And Jesse Chavarria was my first editor, and you know Jesse. And he really liked the idea of having some ambitions towards doing bigger things. And to be honest, it wasn't like, if you look back, there's a city editor named R.B. Brenner, who went on to be an editor at the Washington Post, and Scott Wilson, who went on, is at the Washington Post, who's really good, really, really good. And they were there earlier. So it wasn't like we were, and I think there's just been some really talented and continue to be really talented people there, you included. But it is a community of the South Coast is like 200,000 people maybe. So it's just there's this different spectrum of types of stories that you could do. But you mentioned the elder abuse stories. We did those. We had that Ponzi story, the Slatkin story.
That's right. Yeah.
We had weird, criminal cases that were interesting narratives too. The Jesse James Hollywood story, which was really kind of a story about families and just, two different families kind of clashing and bad things happening. Those are some of the things I worked on. Yeah.
Yeah. And did you cover the postal shooting? Were you around?
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually there that night. And and that was kind of interesting because at the time, it was Andy or Jerry, maybe it was Jerry, who kind of gave me the gift of allowing me to be kind of like a player coach. And so I was projects reporting, but with a couple other people. And so I did that first night. I remember knocking on, sort of pieced together some of the stuff, and I figured out where she had lived, and I knocked on that door, and turns out that was where one of the victims was, who was leaning against the door on the other side of the door. Of course, they never came to the door, and they weren't found until the next morning. That was a little eerie. But that story was interesting because we sent some people to New Mexico. We did a lot of she had family in New York and New Jersey. We were able to get portions of her diary and things like that. Anyway, yeah.
Appreciated your maturity, poise. I know I've said it a couple times, but it's really a rare quality, like to be able to have all this stuff come at you and triage it in a way where you make your reporters around you feel confident enough to approach the story. And that's something that you definitely have. Like I don't think I've ever had to deal with like, oh my goodness, Scott's overreacting again to the story. Calm down, Scott. That's just not, it's always like measured, appropriate direction. Hey, so, when you left the news press, you eventually got this really good job, right? Got hired at 23andMe, which I don't know if at the time it was like big and everybody kind of knew what they were doing, or if it blew up a few years later. But can you talk to me a little bit about what you're doing now and sort of, what 23andMe is doing and how they've been impacted by COVID?
Yeah, I can also, it didn't just happen like that. I mean, it's a long story, but first of all, I left the news press and I ended up working at the Ventura County Star for a while, and I continued doing projects there for 3 years and covered a bunch of different stuff. The housing crisis. I covered a big environmental Superfund site. I covered the military, did a bunch of other things. But what was going on, which you could probably relate, and a lot of journalists out there can relate to, is you could just see this thing happening in front of you, which is like a big game of musical chairs in which the chairs are getting ripped out from under you, essentially, in terms of what you're going to do. And I did have, when I left the news press, I had the ability, I think you went to the Mercury, right?
Yes.
And so I think I was interviewing in Santa Rosa and Sacramento, and went to DC and interviewed there, Maryland and New Jersey. And I'm like, I grew up moving all the time because my dad was in the Army, and I had 2 little kids. I didn't want to do that. And I knew that I just also like could imagine moving to Sacramento and then like a year later saying, oh, we're going to have layoffs, right? There just wasn't a lot of security. We were pretty much hand to mouth anyway. It's not like we got paid a ton of money doing what we were doing. So I was looking for work, and I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you more than you want to know, but this explains there was no grand plan. I actually spent a year trying to become a cop. And I think you remember this. And I actually
that. You did. Sorry, you tell us.
I did.
Yeah.
No, I did.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So I was an old dude becoming a cop, and I got into the academy. I remember Cam Sanchez invited me over to his office. We shook hands. He's like, I'm super excited that you're going to do this. But I had this, I had a torn rotator cuff that I hadn't done anything about, surfing injury for a couple of years, and I couldn't do tons of push-ups, right? Stupid, right? So I get this thing fixed, and because I'm older, I'm not ready for the academy. And I was supposed to start at the end of the year. This was like November, and they said, okay, we can push it off until like February or something. Meanwhile, my sisters were like, hey, maybe you don't really want to be a cop. You don't want to do this. Maybe you should look into this thing. And I had a sister who said, hey, she had worked at Apple, and said they were looking for somebody, and I, sent something, and I got an interview. I'm like, stoked, that's great. And when that happened, I had another sister said, this other company, this friend of mine works for this company called 23andMe. And so I just kind of got 2 interviews really quickly. This never happens, right? I came out of the Apple interview going, boy, that would be cool to work there, but I didn't get an offer. I went to the interview with 23andMe, and I'm like, these guys are just really young and way too smart for me, but this is really cool. And I ended up getting an offer, and I was like, I can't do this because I've already shook hands with the chief, and I want to do this. And the idea about me becoming a cop I didn't have the desire to become a street cop. I thought I could do that for a little bit and then become an investigator, maybe work for the DA's office or something like that, because I had friends doing that, and I had friends that were cops, and I thought that I had an aptitude towards doing that. I was pretty good with documents and tracking people down and getting information. Anyway, the thing with 23andMe, just, it was kind of a fluke, and they offered me good money for me, for someone who's a reporter. It's like, wow, they pay that much. And and I just, it was cool. And I was the oldest person there, and when I started, there were about 40 people. And I got to see a lot of things that I wasn't really familiar with, working for a business, and but also a business that was sort of creating a new industry, essentially. And so and I've been here since then. And it's very strange for someone in Silicon Valley to stay with a company for as long as I have. Usually people are, 2 to 3 years, and then they move to another place. But I just learn a lot, always it's obviously very science-driven genetics company. And then you ask about COVID.
Since you talked about trying to become a cop, do you remember the day you told Cam Sanchez or whoever you told that you weren't going to do it? And can you walk me through that?
Yeah, I told him, and then I'm blanking on, there was I mean, first of all, at the time, this was during the recession, so a ton of people applied. There were only, I think they had 5 spots in the academy. And so, you know, it was winnowed down from a gazillion candidates. So it was a very fortunate thing to get to that point. So I felt really bad, and they were really supportive. And once you got past this thing, it was a lot of screening. And I did talk to somebody, and they had somebody else. I talked to Cam, and Cam said, wait to decide this. I want you to talk to this other. So they had me talk to a sergeant, and I really was just basically saying it's about money and my family, essentially. I realized that if I was to do this job, and I'm going to digress for a second. During my time at the Star, I was in Iraq for a little while, and it was a great experience. But it was also kind of selfish of me, because I didn't really realize how difficult that was for my wife. Not just because I was away, but more because of the fear of what would happen. And so, like, every time something happened, she was assuming something terrible. And even in sleepy Santa Barbara, this stuff happens, right? And so I was really thinking a lot about that. And the reality is, I actually probably could have made very good money, but I would have been working overtime and doing these extra shifts, and that would have been a big burden on my family. So when I had that conversation with the sergeant, I just said, I think this is just the right thing for me to do, right? So yeah, it was hard.
And do you think about it ever? Like, what if?
I thought about it, like, within about a year of that. So that class of people that I would have come out of the academy with, I'm not sure if everyone graduated. I think most everyone made it through, but I'm not sure. But do you remember there was a shooting on State Street? And it was like at Zello or outside of Zello on State Street, where this guy who's actually like a Navy Seabee or something, and he pulled a gun and he was shot by cops, Santa Barbara PD.
That was a while ago, maybe vaguely. Yeah, Zello.
That was 1 year after.
Okay.
Right, and so I was like, oh, I would have potentially been on, obviously, with another officer and been in that position. I mean, they had to do that or whatever, but I would hate to have been in that position.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did.
And I love how you just throw in, oh, and also I was in Iraq, and I think that points to another one of your qualities is your humility. You really love the journalism. It's not about you. Whereas a lot of people, they might say that the first thing to sort of, mark their territory, like I've done that. But, for you, it was just another thing that you did in your career. A very admirable thing to do. But for you, it's just part of the job. So 23andMe, right? So what we can forgive me. I'm just going to be like sort of my impression of it. You can get a DNA, a background check, or a test, find out your relatives by, saliva, spitting into a cup, a dish. Obviously, it's advanced beyond that. Tell me what 23andMe does.
There are no dishes involved. There's no background check.
No vial? No.
No. You spit into a tube, you send it off, they extract DNA from it, and they do what's called genotyping. So you're looking at certain segments in the genome that we know the most about. And from that information, yes, you can learn stuff about your ancestry, different places that your relatives are from, and you can connect yourself to other relatives if you want to do that. But there's also this whole health side of the product, which is basically your predispositions towards different conditions that are, that have a genetic component. And then the company also allows people to sort of opt in if they wish to research. And that's really fascinating because that pooled genetic and phenotypic data. So genetic data is your obviously your genetics. The phenotypic data is like kind of everything else. Your medical history, your ethnicity, your if you're a man or a woman, all that stuff is pooled together, and you can really see how all of that data pooled together can tell you a lot about the origin of illnesses, and that can tell you about ways to potentially treat those things. And that's what's really kind of, I think, revolutionary about it. So yeah, that's what we do.
And there's a lot more competitors now. Wasn't 23andMe sort of the first company to do this? And now I feel like I see commercials for this kind of stuff a lot. Is that fair, or is 23andMe unique in the market?
We're unique in that we do several different things that not any one company does. So there's a company that just looks at your ancestry, for instance. Mm-hmm. There are companies that do essentially they'll look at certain portions of your genome to report a certain conditions, like for breast cancer. But there are very few competitors that do. And then there's like these telehealth, like virtual health companies that are doing stuff that we're doing, but there's no company that's doing all of the stuff that we're doing together, and no company yet that is really doing this, looking at what this data can tell you about illness, like for research and for potential treatments. And that's really new.
And what do you do specifically? How were you able to use your journalism skill set in this job?
So I'm just a writer and editor, right? So we create a lot of content. I'm not on the marketing team. I'm on the communications team. So I'm doing PR, a lot of stuff on our blog. I do ghostwriting, messaging, and things like that. And there's just like, you're communicating a pretty complicated science, right? So you want to be, how do you do that in a way that's interesting and compelling and that people can understand? And that's kind of what we do as a journalist, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you definitely are missed in Santa Barbara for your journalism, but I know that 23andMe obviously values you, in the same ways, and you're doing, I'm sure, great work there. I dabbled in other jobs too. I went and worked at the Mercury News, and, much like you, it's like the kids and the family drive everything. And, I could have stayed up at San Jose and, be a Scott Hadley one day, right? Like keep rising and being like that top notch. But then you have children, and, then your wife doesn't want to move. And then you've got to decide, do I want to be a divorced dad who has a great journalism career, but doesn't see their kids? Or do I want to spend time with my kids and make the journalism work somehow in the small town, And so that's what I decided to do. And I did some PR for a little while, but I love journalism, and for whatever reason, just, cobbling together all these jobs to try to.
No, it's really impressive. And I remember us having these conversations. I remember you struggling. I think for a while you were like commuting back and forth. And then, if you're still working as a journalist today, that's so impressive to be able to build a career right now, because it's really hard. There are exceptions, right? But there's just so few good paying jobs. And I think what you've put together is pretty impressive. I love watching the podcast, by the way. And I still follow everybody's work, and you are now like kind of the man with all the contacts, right, in the city, which is pretty impressive. And there's still these people that I really admire. I mean, I think you probably feel the same way about, Nick Welsh and Melinda and Jerry. And I'm sure I'm leaving other people out, but you just like, oh my God, that those are all people that are part of this pretty small community, and they're so talented, and so the city's been lucky, right, in that way.
Scott, before we wrap up, I want to just sort of get an update on you now. You're in the Bay Area, right? But your kids, you still have this tie to Santa Barbara. Tell us about your kids and, sort of where you're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, we still, my wife and I have always planned to go back to Santa Barbara. My kids are now in college. I have a freshman and a junior, and they're both at UCSB. And my wife's father, we had a rough period during COVID where we lost some family members, and both of us kind of dealing with that at the same time. And I'm sure, like everybody has gone through the sort of reassessment of what's important and things like that. We both, even though it's been a long time, I still have very, very close friends in Santa Barbara. Non-journalism friends as well as journalism friends, and we have family still down there. So we kind of go down there periodically every year.
What's it like to be a dad now that you have college kids? I've got a junior, and so in a couple of years, the whole world's going to change. But I also have an 8-year-old, so I'll still be in that dad mode for a long time. But what's it been like for you to sort of have both your kids out of the house?
It's less exciting. I feel really boring because having them around. They're both really cool people, and my wife and I I think you'll hear this from anybody who's gone through this sort of where you're like, oh, now what do we do? What are we going to talk about? So we're going through that a little bit. And, there's like some nostalgia for having them around, obviously. It's weird. There's like some trauma of having a high school age kid, a teenager. There's a lot of stuff that you deal with during that time. And then all of a sudden they're gone and you're like, whoa, wow. But what's been pretty cool is that like with my daughter, this happened a while ago, and is that you just started relating to them in a different way. It's like more as peers, and that's kind of neat. And then I guess the only other thing is it's not like you're not going to be a parent anymore. So there's stuff that's always happening that we're helping with. So that's, your job forever.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time, Scott. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And, we went from talking every day for hours and having lunch a couple times a week to, sort of long distance, like, occasional communication. So it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you and do it in this format and give people the opportunity to know a little bit about you and what an incredible journalist you were, are, maybe one day will be again. So thanks a lot for your time, Scott.
Thank you, Josh. It's really nice of you to say all that stuff. And I feel equally impressed by what you do, what you're continuing to do. So thank you for that.
All right. Thank you.